What's up, guys? How are we doing? Good day so far? Yeah? Woo! I'll go, what's up, man? All right, so my talk, let's see if we can get the picture up here. So I say the cancer of the modern world. And, in a lot of ways, like, that's provocative. It's like, oh, yeah, we have cancer. It's big and red. But I don't actually use this lightly. I think it's actually a really, really apt analogy for what's going on in the economy. And more importantly, interestingly, it's actually a global problem. The US is really at the center of it, but it's the entire Western world. And my subtitle here is Why the West is Dying and How to Save It. And I would say that it's pretty well known, at least in these circles, that the West is kind of rotting a little bit. Like, who kind of feels that way? That things are getting harder, things are getting more expensive, that there's a rough. There's a sense of, I would say, dread looming. But it is really, really hard to see. And it's funny that how our money works is why it's really hard to see. So, cancer. What is cancer? When you have cells, there's a bajillion interdependent systems and communication mechanisms inside the human body. Like, we are an unbelievably complex organism, to the point that we do not understand how any of this shit works. We really don't. Like, we have a lot of decent guesses that turn out to be right most of the time in, like, really naive examples. But for the most part, we are dumb monkeys in relationship to a lot of the big, complex, difficult systems that we have to deal with. And cancer is what happens when the ability for a cell to self-regulate how much it grows and how much it consumes stops working. That it ceases to be able to make this communication properly. And so it just kind of consumes and grows until basically one of three things happens. Either there's something to replace and cure the problem, or you go in and cut it out, or the organism dies. That's basically your three options. And unfortunately, for a really long time, it was basically just the organism dies. Luckily, we have a lot of new technology that makes that a lot less the case today. So why do I say the West has cancer? This is a visualization of a eukaryotic cell. This went viral on social media a couple years ago, or within the last couple of years, and it keeps circulating around. And it was actually said that this is like the most detailed cross-sectional picture of a human cell that we ever have. That's not true. This is not a picture. In fact, the person who made this came out and said in a statement that, like, you can't even get wavelengths of light to take a picture at this scale. But this is literally a model. This is an attempt to illustrate all of the complexity inside of a single cell. And what I want to illustrate with this, and a single eukaryotic cell, and there's a quote from the author, says, although people are struck by the complexity and density of this environment, what we depict is actually really dilute in its concentration relative to a real cell. The image is an attempt to synthesize the mountains of structural data that labs around the world have generated and to visualize the great complexity and beauty of the cell's molecular choreography. We have no idea what's going on in there. Like, we have no effing clue. Like, look at all of this. The best thing that we can do is create some, like, bizarre abstract model, and it'll kind of be right a lot of the time, and we can try desperately to isolate some of the pieces of it, but it's like a controlled experiment where the experiment itself changes the conditions. Like, there are just certain things that you cannot know and you cannot test. That's why I think intuition is something that has been critical to human survival, because the best we can do is abstract. Now, they also used a term, or a line that I thought was so relevant to our conversation. A vast underwater city. There are countless things talking, communicating, literally making decisions inside of this one thing. We have 40 trillion cells in our body. Hundreds of different types, thousands, millions of subtypes and suborganizations and subsystems. I got out of breath. I was almost late here. I ran all the way here. I was totally out of breath. My skin was flush. I was sweating. I have so many different systems in my body that were trying to make sure that resources got to where they were going to go, how to pull in oxygen. I was breathing faster. And again, I wasn't doing any of this. I was not centrally planning any of this. And if we ever attempted to centrally plan, I promise you we would all die very, very quickly. We would suck really, really bad at it. A vast underwater city. The economy and society is an organic system. It's not a machine. It's not a couple of gears and pistons. It's not something that we can map out with 5 different pieces and understand. Not only is it organic, but it's subjective. You can't measure it either. Like, I can't just decide that you have 10 points of happiness. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I can't decide that you have 14 and a half quality of life units. It doesn't, a subjective value measurement is not possible. And yet, all of our metrics, here we go. Hopefully it doesn't go too far. All of our metrics for understanding the economy are quantitative. So, if society is a vast organic system that is impossible to understand with as many moving parts as a human body, what keeps it in check? Why don't we eat ourselves into oblivion? Like, think about that. You know, like, as an individual, it's really easy to, plan and detail out how you're going to consume resources, right? Like if you have 2 sandwiches, you're not going to put 3 meals on your calendar. I'm going to eat lunch sandwich, dinner sandwich, and the next day, I'm not going to be surprised when I go to my fridge and I'm out of sandwiches. Like, it's very easy for me to, clearly all of you are very good at it. Nobody's dead. Everybody is alive in here. You got good at that. But now imagine a scenario, which I'm sure many of you have been in, myself included, where you have an apartment with 3 or 4 people, and somebody just eats your sandwich or gets into your cereal, something like that, or scoops your peanut butter because they didn't have any of theirs. Imagine we tried to have, just this apartment, we tried to have one person decide and get all of the food for everybody in that apartment. Tell me how well that's going to work. Everybody else can eat and consume as much as they want, and only one person's deciding what to get and how much to get. Who thinks that's going to work? Good. Nobody raised their hand. That would be an absolute disaster. Society is that with billions of people. We can't do this with 3 or 4. Trying to pull that off is an impossible task. How can you coordinate against people that you don't even know where they are? You don't know how many sandwiches they have. You don't know whether they like sandwiches. Maybe they're growing oranges. This, I want you to take away how unbelievably, retardedly impossible that task is. And no, it can't be centrally planned. It will die as fast as a human organism trying to map out with a managerial staff and a committee going well, should we breathe more right now, or should we put more blood to the foot that we wounded yesterday? It's not going to work. Money is the reason it works. Prices are the signal that organizes it. I'll give you an example. China, we have a global economy. There's a typhoon in the Pacific, and It gets really bad, and it runs through, and it just eviscerates the eastern coast of China. And it happens to hit one of the most important ports for the supply chain of wood sheathing building materials in the world. Like half of the Western world gets their wood from this place. And so they're completely out of commission. In a matter of hours, thanks to communication networks, thanks to trade networks and finance and every other thing, within a matter of hours, at the least a day or two, the price of wood is going to double everywhere. Maybe triple, maybe quadruple. It's going to be really, really expensive. Now, if you were planning on building a deck and you go out and see that the decking boards that you allocated $2,000 for is not going to cost you $9,000, you're going to be like, I don't need a deck this bad. Like, I will wait. Understand, you don't have to know that anything happened in China. Everybody suddenly makes their decisions based on the reality of the need somewhere halfway around the world, even though you don't have to know what happened. The price regulated your behavior. Now, another interesting thing about price is going back to the idea of like 10 happy points or 14.5 quality points, is that because it's subjective, we can't measure it. So how do we get a number that tells us whether or not we should make a decision? It's all relative. Value is and only can be relative, which means that my ability, like if this mic costs $1 trillion reduce, is that expensive? Is this an expensive mic? You have no idea. You have no clue. It's $1 trillion reduce. Sounds like a lot. Well, what if I can go mow somebody's lawn and get $300 billion reduce? Well, it's not that expensive of a mic. Well, maybe it's a really, really big yard and it's going to take me a long time. Or if I go and mow somebody's lawn and I get $5 reduce, I am never going to buy this thing. This is not that good of a mic. I mean, it's kind of cool, but it's clearly a very expensive thing, but only because I can relate it to something in my life, some cost that I felt the weight of. Value is subjective. Wealth, or it can only be measured relatively. Uh-oh, wrong way. So, debt and savings. Money, what's really important about understanding how prices actually weigh things is when I say it's a weighting system, is that it only translates a voluntary decision and an action. Like it is what it costs me in order to obtain. I think I'm missing a slide. Whatever. It's only relevant what it costs me. So, when I go to buy something worth $1 trillion reduce, it's specifically because I sat on that mower and I rode around that yard and sweated and dealt with the weight, the costly experience of what it took to get the $300 billion reduce, and then the value that I project and assume will be received from the mic, that decision has any merit whatsoever. If I just write down $1 trillion reduce on a piece of paper, there is zero weight to that decision. I cannot and will never understand what the cost is. And it's very important to understand that we have a system, we all have systems of government and systems of money where literally they try to fix problems by writing down on a piece of paper a bunch of numbers and then making economic decisions about it. There's a reason why it doesn't work. There's a very fundamental reason why it doesn't work. It's a lot like saying that when my body is really uncomfortable and I'm sweating and flushed and I'm sprinting really hard and I'm breathing really hard, that's not comfortable. It's not fun. It's also not fun to have to pay a whole lot for wood at the store if I want to build a deck. But for the same reason, we do not manipulate the price down so that so that people will go build decks even though they don't need to, because the wood needs to be shipped halfway around the world in order to rebuild the supply chain that allows wood to actually flow to the rest of the globe. The reason we wouldn't do that and shouldn't do that is the same reason why when I am out of breath and sweating, we should definitely not inject me with some inhibitor so that I will calm down and stop breathing. That's a really, really bad idea. Those things happen for a reason. So if prices coordinate resources across the economy, how does it coordinate resources across time? Debt and savings. So what is debt? What's a deficit? It is a collective, with money as a record-keeping system. It's basically a collective budgeting system. You know, like if you go out and you do a whole lot of work and you save up $100,000 by helping a whole bunch of people and doing a bunch of favors and trading with them, well, that's a record. That's 100,000 units of saying that you did 100,000 units of favors for other people and society hasn't paid you back yet. It's your redemption note. It's a receipt. It's literally proof of work, as long as you're not manipulating the money. As long as you can't cheat it, it means something. So, as a record-keeping system, how do we allow someone to use up some resources somewhere, even if they haven't produced it, but still be able to balance in the future that it's okay, they'll put it back, and importantly to know that it's acceptable for them to consume those resources. Because if there are 5 houses or 5 sandwiches in the economy and then you loan somebody enough money to eat 7 sandwiches, we're going to have a real big problem, because 5 people who thought they were going to be able to eat aren't going to be able to eat. You should only be able to loan, literally, the resource. Like 2 people will say, well, I don't need a sandwich today, so I'm going to save those 2 sandwiches, and so now we can loan 2 sandwiches. If the savings and the debt aren't connected, then it's all meaningless. We're all just eating stuff, and we have no idea if we're actually running out of anything. So the price of tomorrow, the interest rate, is the price of using up resources now and deciding when and how we can actually pay it back. So we have every country in the modern world has a central bank that plans and manipulates this price. It tries to centrally decide what the cost of using up resources today versus tomorrow is. That's a chart of the US debt. And that doesn't look sustainable to me. And what's bad is that the chart going to 2012 looked exactly the same. And the chart going to 2040 is going to look exactly the same. Like, it sounds crazy right now because, you know, back in 2009, an $800 billion bailout was bonkers, and now it's just like $2 trillion plan to fix inflation. The U.S. debt's going to be probably around 100 to 150 trillion at the year 2040. And there's not really any way around that. This thing just keeps running. In fact, we can't get out of it without issuing more debt to pay the interest on the debt that we are running up now. Back to what is debt and what is savings. Debt is a proof of net destruction of resources. That is all it is. It's just proof that even though we only created $100,000 worth of stuff, we destroyed 150. 50 is the debt. It's the deficit. So we have 50,000 units in debt. That means that we need to put it back. It's really important that we put it back, because otherwise we are literally just consuming endlessly and never actually putting the resources back in. The ability to take those favor receipts into the economy and take resources, food, housing, these things out of the economy. We have a giant societal pool of resources, and we have to make sure that if people are taking it out, they are putting it back in, because otherwise the pool of resources are just being endlessly depleted and not being replenished. Now, the interesting and sad thing about the US and the West, the reason we survive so well and have for so long, generally, also it's really important to understand that these trends usually happen on 50 to 100-year timelines. Society is huge. Society is huge. It is complex. It's got 1 billion interoperable pieces and interdependent systems. It takes a really long time for problems to show themselves. We've been doing this one really since about 1970. We're starting to feel the end game of fiat. This doesn't work. This doesn't go on. And in fact, there's not a single time in history in which that did not result in either the destruction of the civilization or the destruction of their money. And usually it's the same thing. Not once. Not once. It's not different. It's not different this time. It just doesn't feel that way because it's a 50 to 100-year timeline. You grew up thinking that this is just how shit works. It's not how anything works. It's how things die. And the entire West has this problem. The reason we've sustained it for so long is because we can actually the US has the global reserve currency, and we actually can expand these networks through other countries. Like if the US was only using our currency domestically, well, then if you printed $6 trillion, prices of everything would go, through the roof, like 3 or 4x before the end of the year. Like it would be an absolute disaster. But the whole world uses the dollar network, which means that we can write down numbers on a piece of paper and export them to somebody else, and then they give us stuff. We just suck up stuff, and the whole West does this. Granted, the dollar gets a vastly oversized benefit as the global reserve, but the entire West gets this benefit. If you've ever read Alex Gladstein's piece, Structural Adjustment, how the IMF, I can't remember the term exactly, it's like subjugates the third world. But one of the stats that came out of that piece that just blew my mind is the IMF is constantly giving loans. The IMF and World Bank are giving loans to third world countries and developing countries all over the place. And they call it benefits and assistance. But you know what the net flow of resources from all of that since like 1960 something is? $64 trillion out of the developing world to the West. $64 trillion net loss. It's not for their benefit. It's not for their benefit. It's for ours. If anybody ever prints money out of thin air and gives you a loan, they didn't help you. They did not help you. Think about it. If I don't own anything, I don't have any money, I don't have any savings, and I just issue $200,000 so you can buy a house, and you go buy that house, you bought me a house. I didn't have anything, now I have a house. You have to pay me back. You owe me $200,000. You live in the house. Interestingly, you rent the house from me. This is a rent seeker's paradise. The way money flows through the fiat system, when you have a political class that can print trillions of dollars, and you have a banking class that has the privilege of just issuing money into existence so that people can buy stuff, that is the surest way to make sure that an economy where everybody is stable, has savings, owns their home, owns their cars, owns their livelihoods, is in a good job with choices, to lose all of it. To have no savings, to rent their house, to rent their car, because you are going to pump the price of everything, and they are going to get it through loans that will overextend the consumption that society cannot actually sustain. People will buy the stuff, and then they will work the rest of their lives paying it back to a bank that never made anything. They didn't build a car, they didn't build a house, nothing. And we do this for trillions of dollars. Like, that number has so many zeros, it's arbitrary. You might as well just call it a bajillion. It's like country buying types of money. And this system gets so bloated. Do you know that since the 1980s, the financial system in the US has doubled in size as a percentage of GDP? Which means that the same finance is it's an organizational system. It's like your accounting software. Like, it's just there to allocate and deal with exchanging resources between the people who own it. It's like, your driveway for your car or whatever. Like, if it costs twice, it should always fall in price. It should always fall as a portion of the economy. If it got better, then it means we spent less on finance to properly communicate ownership. Technology should make that better. It doubled in size. And what happens when you bloat the financial system? Well, you just create this giant system of gambling. You create a system of corruption. You create a system of grift. You push trillions into subsidies. It enables the creation and sustaining of businesses that are never profitable and never actually made economic sense. Our central banks manipulate the price of interest and the consumption of resources in such a way that the banks and giant corporations get prices that are ridiculous. The United States government, the Federal Reserve, kept the interest rate at 0% for a decade. Think about what that means. If you bought a lawnmower let's order it on time. Crap. If you bought a lawnmower for $3,500, 1% interest rate, would you rent that lawnmower out? 1% interest for, I think it's $2,500, whatever, it doesn't matter. 1% is something like $7 a month that you do not get to use your lawnmower and somebody else does. So now you have to mow your lawn like 3 or 4 times a month, which means you have to rent. You have to get a lawnmower from somebody else. And at the end of that year, your lawnmower is worth $1,500 best because it's been used for a year. Would you ever loan those resources out for $7 a month? If you're lucky and you have a small yard, it's going to cost you $40 to mow once. Why wouldn't you do that? Do you realize that huge corporations are getting loans of $100 billion at 1%? That cannot possibly be the natural price of using up $1 billion worth of capital. What would you give up anywhere in your lives for 1%? Nothing. It's really important to us. It's just not important to the people who write $1 billion on a piece of paper and give it to their political buddy. And of course, it doesn't cost them shit. They get it from us. And the price of all our stuff, the price of our houses go up, the price of rent goes up, the price of food goes up, the price of everything that we could possibly want goes up. And the only stuff that falls is technology. And it's because it's just growing faster than they print. But you can't eat an iPad. And I hope nobody tried. Oh, man, I'm out of time. All right. It's hard to illustrate how huge the misallocation of resources is because we live inside of the misallocation. We think that the way things are shaped, the way business works, the way that finance works, the way that governments work, that somehow this is natural and normal. So we can't separate ourselves from it. It's the fish and water example that we all know. They don't understand what it means to be wet. And I hope that if you take anything away from this, it's that we have a big problem that's really, really hard to see, but it's really, really big. The good news is that we can fix it. And the reason I call it a cancer is because we have manipulated the price in such a way that not only does the government can tax, a thief is a parasite. A taxation is parasitic. But a cancer is something where not only is the person stealing the resources going to benefit at our expense? But it actually encourages all of us to make the same bad decisions. It encourages us to buy a house when it actually doesn't make sense to buy a house. It encourages us to change and invest and manipulate our resources in a way that is not sustainable. And that chart shows you exactly how not sustainable it is. And we will pay the price. We'll pay the price sooner than most people think. And it will hurt, and it will be messy, and it will be gross. And we have 3 options. We either cut it out. It's going to happen until the money and society dies, or we fix it with something that makes that communication signal, that brings it back into the economy and can put us back in balance. That's our option. I like number 3. All right. Thank you, guys.
Ladies and gentlemen, Guy Swann.